Well, gédal sios tó fircin fóidir a gléir agus áhas ar bhéine sa bheith chéine go raibh seansach tíocht agus seansach hén cásadin. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends, may I first of all extend to you all, and particularly to those of you who have travelled from afar, bienvenida a la casa del Presidente, and Kate Miller Fudge towards the Throne, and indeed to Ireland. And I also wish to thank Maurice Cohen, Chairman of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, for his support in organising today's reception. Maruk Dronaherin, as President of Ireland, it's my very great pleasure to host this gathering of delegates of the World Jewish Congress, where ever since its foundation in 1936, your organisation has been working tirelessly to vindicate the rights of Jewish people around the world, and today it represents the Jewish communities of 100 countries across 6 continents. And it was such a pleasure to meet ambassadors and representatives from all those different countries. I am aware that this is your 3rd annual conference, and the fact that you're holding it in Dublin is testament to the commitment and dynamism of Ireland's small Jewish community, a community that has made and continues to make such a rich contribution to the life of this island, to Irish arts, professions and politics. Indeed, I am so pleased to see Mervyn Taylor here, my colleague in 2 governments, 1903 to 1997, and was most you're coming to Ireland at a time of great global and regional uncertainty in so many places and in so many ways, a time when close to home, Ireland and Europe, indeed when the consequences of deepening inequalities, poverty, exclusion, unemployment, all things that have betrayed, if you like, the commitment to cohesion in economic circumstances upon which so many had placed their hopes. The consequences, of course, are being exploited by new forces of the extreme right, and the language is, unfortunately, now again one of hate, and the intention is to exploit ignorance and fear, and to do so in a way that I feel Massa could ultimately weaken and even destroy democracy itself. We live in a time when in so many quarters of the world we see barbed wire being raised, walls being erected, walls of fear and insecurity, walls between nations, walls between rich and poor, walls between what are called creditor nations and debtor nations, walls between those on the move, 65 million people on our planet who are currently displaced, and those who feel threatened in their self-definitions of rootedness and who may be seeking to assert claims to exclusive forms of propriety and entitlement. Ours are times when the universal principles of human rights, which may have been lodged, I think, as well in ancient faiths and ancient forms, including, as I've said, the faith systems of the world, and upon which the nations of the world sought to rebuild the international system in the wake of World War II, are being challenged by a new surge of religious intolerance, newly reinvigorated nationalist passions, and divisive identity politics. And yet at the same time, ours is an age of unprecedented interdependence at global level. Challenge is to forge that interdependence in an ethical way. But we're witnessing a landslide movement towards entrenchment and fragmentation, both within and between our societies. Racism and xenophobia are garnering electoral power in many countries, and indeed one of the most important international agreements aimed at the very future of the planet itself, recently secured for our humanity's common future at the meetings in Paris, is now being challenged in a most alarming way. It seems to me, dear friends, that Jewish communities and organizations around the world have a distinctively important contribution to make to any concerted international response to these urgent challenges that I mentioned. Yes, indeed, as the children of communities who have suffered unspeakably from the most extreme form of racialist hatred, an ancient hatred, unfortunately, as a scattered nation with a deep understanding of the migratory condition, but also as a people who have a long experience of the sometimes conflicting demands of universalism and particularism, and as the inheritors of a long, deep-seated intellectual and philosophical tradition that has informed and continues to inform contemporary philosophical thought and practice and science, there is so much that you can bring to the global conversation. Jewish people have at several junctures in their history been the victims, as I have said, of the worst kind of racism, which often sought to exploit ignorance and build on it an ideology that would be used to persecute Jewish people in so many places. This was most tragically the case during the Second World War, when the Nazi ideology and its genocidal system led to the destruction of a third of the world Jews. Last month, at the 75th anniversary commemorations of the massacre of the Babi Yar ravine in the outskirts of Kiev, the president of the World Jewish Congress, Ronald S. Lauder, said how remembering this ominous event was more important than ever. All of us, Jewish and non-Jewish, can still shiver at the thought of Auschwitz and Babi Yar, and it is indeed of the utmost importance that we continue to remember the unprecedented, unique, almost unthinkable tragedy that the Holocaust was, and that we do so in a respectful, historical, accurate, and meaningful manner. It is of the utmost importance, too, that we go further and recognize the devastation that never fails to stem from ideologies of the lesser, including colonizations and authoritarian impositions that refuse to see other people as fully human. Recognizing the full humanity of others, rejecting any temptation to amnesia or evasive amnesia, being alternatively rather committed to an ethical use of memory, does not cause us and should not cause us to be frozen by the burden of memory. It must instead, as it can, sustain our capacity to engage with both present challenges and future possibilities. And with an experience such as yours comes the opportunity and the challenge of discerning and vindicating the universality of human rights, wherever and in whatever circumstances they are being denied. I know that all of you who are delegates to the World Jewish Congress are particularly wary of not letting the poison of anti-Semitism spread again. No, it is not acceptable to see armed police outside synagogues and Jewish schools across European cities. Your vigilance is one in which we must all share, and it is also one that must enable us all to better detect and combat all forms of discriminations and exclusions and hate speech, wherever they arise, and whether they are based on race, religion, sexual preference, gender, cultural history, physical appearance, or mental abilities. We must engage too with the taken for granted assumptions that have deepened and sustained the inequalities that in turn are that used as sources for these messages of hate. We must face up as intellectual workers too to what we have not questioned before. For example, that economic challenges are technocratic rather than political. For after all, that is the mask, the subterfuge, that has allowed ever more complex structures of global inequality to sustain themselves. Irish history, of course, is unfortunately not exempt from some of the darkest features that have characterized the attitudes of other nations towards their Jewish citizens. To grasp the highs and lows of Jewish life in Ireland, it is worth recalling the life story of the late Gerald Goldberg, who passed away just over 10 years ago. Born in a Yiddish-speaking household, Gerald Goldberg was, like so many members of the Irish Jewish community, the son of Jewish Lithuanian refugees, or Litvaks, who fled the terrifying outbreak of pogroms in Tsarist Russia at the turn of the last century. In Ireland, the Goldberg family then found themselves caught in the 1904 Limerick riots in the south of the country. Those riots and boycott created by a clericalist abuse of irrational fears, whipped up to mob violence. Those events ruined Limerick's Jewish tradesmen and led a majority of them to depart for Cork City, a city of which Gerald Goldberg would go on to be elected Lord Mayor in 1977. Asked once in an interview if he had encountered much anti-Jewish prejudice during his lengthy public career, Goldberg replied, "Oh yes, yes indeed." And then after a pause, "In Dublin they always have the knife out for the Cork man." But may I recall another piece of history that is available to us, but in this case as exemplary solidarity. And that is the story of Max Levitas, of the Levitas family, a Jewish family who lived in the Harcourt Street area of Dublin City. Their story was recently recalled and made the subject of an article in the Irish Times by Joe O'Shea, who described how Levitas' father and mother had escaped the 1913 pogroms in Latvia and Lithuania and met in Dublin, where 3 years later, 1-year-old Max and his brother and sister were put on the floor of their tenement by their mothers as bullets flew during the Easter Rising. A few years earlier, Mr. Levitas Sr.'s efforts to form an Irish Jewish trade union for tailors had been defeated by employers who had blacklisted him. He was an ally and close friend of James Larkin. But Jewish families during the 1913 lockout of William Martin Murphy, Jewish families took in children of workers who were locked out of their workplaces, and thus it was that Max Levitas became a leader of the popular resistance to Oswald Mosley's fascist movement when October the 4th, 1936, thousands resisted Mosley's army of black shirts who had the protection of the police. And they faced Mosley, who was travelling in an open Rolls Royce and giving the salute. Max Levitas was one of those who organised that protest. And Maurice Levitas, his brother, later joined the Connolly column of the International Brigade that went on to fight the fascists in Spain. I wrote to Max Levitas 2 years ago on his 100th birthday. And I've had the pleasure also of corresponding with his niece, Ruth Levitas, Professor of Sociology at Bristol University, alongside whom I spoke on the utopian traditions some time ago at Limerick University. And I'm glad that Max Levitas is very well. He went on to have the distinction of being elected as a communist member of the Council for East London. Today, Ireland's Jewish community may be getting smaller. Many of the younger generation of Irish Jews have gone to live their lives overseas. And indeed, to uncover the reasons which led so many of them to leave this island would probably teach us much about ourselves as a society. Is this immigration the product of the restlessness of the young, or of the internationalism that an intergenerational migratory culture brings? Is it motivated by the same factors that have recently seen numerous young Irish people of all backgrounds depart, or other specific factors, perhaps unspoken or less visible, underlying Irish Jewish immigration? These questions certainly, for scholars, are certainly worthy of study and debate. In sustaining our vigilance against racism, we can, I believe, find great inspiration in the Jewish tradition of universalism, as an outlook which values humankind as a whole above any single one of its components. And there is, too, a rich universalist orientation in the work of Jewish philosophers from the earliest times, through the medieval period, which gave us the writings of the great Maimonides, born in Islamic Cordova, and on through Baruch Spinoza, who was one of those who laid the groundwork for the 18th century European Enlightenment. And we can also think of so many philosophers in the modern period, such as, to name but one, Emmanuel Levinas, another son of Lithuania, who became a French citizen and adopted the French language, and whose ethical phenomenology speaks so beautifully of the unlimited responsibility that stems from our encounter with the face of the other. Of course, Judaism has also for centuries striven to reconcile this universalistic orientation with an equally strong orientation towards particularism, the preservation and continuation of its unique traditions. Those frictions between universalism and particularism, such as they've historically been played out within Judaism, deserve our attention, for they speak powerfully to our present condition. Judaism tells us that it is possible to cultivate one's particular cultural and spiritual identity while also cultivating reason, freedom of thought and inquiry, and the universal quest for liberty and justice, as values that bind all of the inhabitants of this world together in their common humanity. The primary and essentially positive inclination to care for one's community, to cherish and nurture one's specific and unique traditions, only benefits, I believe, from being compounded by an equally fundamental, although admittedly may perhaps less instinctive, concern for universal human rights. The appeal to the latter is not limited to an appeal to reason. It invokes also the shared instincts of the wisdom of the heart and of belief. Such rich philosophical universalism is a source that can inform the policies, the language and the actions that are used in the necessary dialogue one must continually seek and sustain with the perceived other in situations of conflict. May I say that this holds true, I suggest, for our consideration of the current state of the political debate in Israel. While the fundamental right of Jewish people to the shelter and security of a state in which their culture can flourish is a principle that should never be questioned, we must never lose sight of the concurrent obligation for that state, like any other state, to respect universal norms and the rights of fellow human beings, with valid claims also to land and to life, memory, cultural flourishing, and security in that land of their ancestors. We must be free to invoke human rights in this universal way. It is not useful to dismiss or even suspect of insensitivity to Jewish life, culture, and security. Those of us who seek to vindicate these values without borders, and who may derive from our own experiences of conflict and exclusion a willingness to bring those values and that experience to the shared conversation we need so as to, for example, build peace and mutual respect in the Middle East region. It is precisely, too, from the memory of their people's history of migration and exile that Jewish people can derive the resources of empathy and understanding that are required so as to extend a hand of fraternity and solidarity to the destitute among the nations. Indeed, the collective experience of dispersion and exile is intrinsically linked to the Jewish standpoint in history. It is also one that finds deep resonance with us Irish, as a people who have also, millions of whom have left these shores of this island. The life and consciousness of the migrant experience, have too often been neglected as one of the most important experiences in forming our human condition, both past and present. As a next sociologist and academic myself, our human sciences have, for example, often been sedentary in their assumptions. But literature, however, was always better, more perceptive, and has often embraced the transience of the migratory experience. And James Joyce is a very good example of this when he gave the world one of its most famous outsiders, the son of a Jewish Hungarian migrant, Leopold Bloom. I see much ethical value in reflecting on the diasporic experience, the experience of a spiritual, non-territorial form of belonging, at a time when unprecedented numbers of men, women and children are becoming refugees in alien lands. The relevance of the Jewish diaspora and all other diasporas, such as the Tibetan one, for example, to humankind as a whole, deserves consideration. Irish and Jewish people do share, I believe, a common appreciation of what the late David Marcus called the hyphenated heritage of the Irish Jewish community. We in Ireland greatly value the hyphenated heritage of all of the members of our own extended, scattered global family, be they Irish American, Irish Australian, or Irish Canadian. And as debates are raging in a number of European countries on the issue of cultural integration, I just want to say on this occasion that I, as President of Ireland, do see the very clear difference between the value of an invited integration and any enforced version of assimilation which would simply seek to achieve the process of reduction of the other to the same. Why should we ever require of Irish Jews, whose grandparents may have been living in a Russian shtetl and whose remote ancestors were perhaps slaves in Babylon or exiles in Persia, that they forget the experience of their ancestors or their age-old dreams? There is absolutely, and there should never be, contradiction in the capacity for Irish Jews to care deeply about their distinctive traditions while also being fully participating citizens in Irish society, and indeed helping us to define Ireland's relationship to a wider world that is ever more interdependent. Dear friends, I court you, ours is indeed a brave new world, threatened by unprecedented possibilities again of mass destruction, be they military or environmental, but also faced with great possibilities for human advances through science and technology, to which there has been such a significant contribution by Jewish scholars and scientists, and more importantly perhaps, through the possibilities that will flow from a new or recovered ethical awareness of the great web of life on our shared planet and its complexity that must be respected. Through what new forms will this life continue its grand unfolding? What is our function in it? Our task as a people, our duties as peoples, as individuals? My hope is that the many nations, cultures and traditions who share this world will respect and draw it in each other in such a way as will release the capacity for a world that is inclusive and hopeful, one as such that might enable us together to accomplish tikkun olam, that is no less than to heal, repair and transform the world so as to allow for the flourishing of all of humanity. Shalom. Thank you.